The room was silent except for the mechanical clicking of rotors turning inside a metal box. It was February 1942, and somewhere in the cold halls of a Victorian mansion in the English countryside, a young mathematician stared at a sequence of letters that made no sense. Outside, convoys were sinking in the Atlantic. Soldiers were dying in the desert. Cities were burning across Europe. And all of it, every movement, every attack, every strategic decision, was being transmitted through the air in coded messages that no one could read. Until now. This isn't a story about bombs or bullets. It's about something far more dangerous. Information. The kind of information that reveals where your ships will be tomorrow morning. The kind that exposes how many tanks you have, how much fuel remains, which cities you plan to strike next. In 1942, one side possessed a machine that turned ordinary words into gibberish. Millions upon millions of possible combinations, shuffled and reshuffled with every keystroke. Military commanders believed it was mathematically impossible to break. They sent their most sensitive orders through it without fear, convinced that even if the enemy intercepted their transmissions, those messages would remain forever locked in chaos. They were wrong. What they didn't know was that a small group of people working in a place that officially didn't exist had found a way inside. And among them was one individual whose insights would change everything. Not through violence but through thought. Through pattern recognition. Through the realization that even chaos follows rules if you know where to look. This is the story of how invisible weapons won the most visible war. How mathematics became a matter of life and death. And how one person's ability to see what others couldn't see may have shortened the war by years and saved millions of lives. All without firing a single shot. Let's establish what we're dealing with. By early 1942, the situation in the Atlantic Ocean had become catastrophic. Merchant convoys carrying food, fuel, weapons, and troops from North America to Britain were being hunted with terrifying precision. Submarines would appear seemingly out of nowhere, attack, and vanish beneath the waves before any defense could respond. Between January and March of that year alone, over 200 ships went to the bottom of the ocean. Thousands of sailors never came home. The Allied Naval Command couldn't understand it. Their convoy routes were supposed to be secret. They changed them regularly. They used radio silence when possible. And yet the enemy always seemed to know where they would be. The answer was simple and devastating. The other side was reading their mail. Not metaphorically. Literally. Naval operations on both sides relied on radio communication. You couldn't run a modern navy without it. Ships scattered across thousands of miles of ocean needed to receive orders, report positions, call for support. But radio transmissions could be intercepted by anyone with the right equipment. So both sides encrypted their messages using machines that scrambled text into apparently random gibberish. The device used by German military forces was called Enigma. It looked like a typewriter fitted with rotors and plugs. You'd type a letter and the machine would output a different letter. A might become Q, then F, then M, depending on the internal settings. Those settings changed constantly, determined by codebooks distributed to operators. There were rotors that could be arranged in different orders. Plugboard connections that swapped letters before and after encryption. Ring settings that shifted the starting position of each rotor. The number of possible configurations was astronomical, literally in the quintillions. From a mathematical standpoint, it seemed perfect. Even if you intercepted a message, even if you knew exactly how the machine worked, you'd never be able to try every possible combination before the settings changed again. The encryption system wasn't just difficult to crack, it was designed to be impossible. Which is why when intelligence services in Britain first obtained an Enigma machine in the late 1930s, they were both excited and horrified. Excited because they now understood the mechanism. Horrified because understanding it didn't help. The machine without the daily settings was just an expensive paperweight. And then the war began, and suddenly this wasn't an abstract puzzle. It was the difference between life and death for thousands of people every single day. While battles raged across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Front, another war was being fought in complete secrecy. The location was a mansion called Bletchley Park, about 50 miles northwest of London. Before the war, it had been a private estate. Now it was the center of Britain's cryptographic operations, housing hundreds of people whose job was to intercept, analyze, and break enemy communications. The work was compartmentalized. People working in one section often had no idea what people in the next building were doing. Security was absolute. Workers were told that discussing their jobs with anyone, even family members, would result in prosecution under wartime secrecy laws. Many would keep these secrets for decades after the war ended. The place operated on a strange rhythm. Intercepted messages would arrive constantly from listening stations scattered across Britain and the Mediterranean. These messages, gibberish strings of 5-letter groups, would be sorted by source and type. Naval messages went to Naval Section. Air Force traffic to Air Section. Different military branches used different Enigma variants with different settings, which meant solving one didn't automatically solve the others. The people doing this work came from unusual backgrounds. There were mathematicians, chess champions, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, anyone who had demonstrated an ability to find patterns in apparent chaos. Some were academics recruited from universities. Others had been identified through puzzles published in newspapers, which were actually secret recruitment tools. What united them was a particular kind of mind, the ability to hold enormous amounts of information simultaneously, to test hypotheses mentally before committing to calculations, to recognize when something that looked random actually contained structure. These weren't necessarily people who were good at traditional academics. They were people who could think sideways, who found conventional approaches boring and immediately started looking for shortcuts. The breakthrough had actually begun before the war, through cooperation with Polish cryptographers who had made the first inroads into Enigma. They had discovered that despite the astronomical number of possible settings, the machine had weaknesses. It could never encrypt a letter as itself, A would never output A. The rotors moved in predictable patterns. And operators, being human, made mistakes. They'd use predictable message formats. They'd send test transmissions. They'd include weather reports in standardized language. These tiny flaws, individually meaningless, became the cracks through which insight could enter. Among the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, one figure stood apart, not because of rank or authority but because of approach. While others worked on refining mechanical methods for testing rotor positions or building catalogs of possible settings, this individual focused on something else entirely, the structure of thought itself. The insight was subtle but profound. Encrypted messages weren't random. They were human communications that had been scrambled, which meant they retained traces of human language, frequency patterns, common words, grammatical structures. German military messages followed protocols. They started with standard phrases. They ended with standard sign-offs. Weather reports used technical vocabulary. Position reports mentioned coordinates. If you could guess even part of a message, even a single word in the right position, you could use that guess to test settings. Not randomly but systematically. You'd align your guess with the encrypted text and work backward through the Enigma mechanism to see what rotor positions would produce that transformation. Most guesses would fail immediately. But occasionally you'd find a setting that worked for your guess and kept working for the rest of the message. When that happened, you'd broken that day's key. This technique, known as cribbing, required a peculiar combination of intuition and logic. You had to think like the enemy operator. What would they say? How would they say it? What words would appear in what context? A weather report at sea would mention wind speed and direction. A commander's order would include unit designations and locations. Even the rigid bureaucracy of military communication became a vulnerability. But here's where it gets interesting. The breakthrough wasn't just technical. It was psychological. The analyst realized that enemy operators weren't faceless encryption machines. They were tired, bored, overworked human beings who wanted to finish their shifts and go to bed. Which meant they'd take shortcuts. They'd use the same encryption settings in predictable ways. When told to choose a random starting position for their rotors, they'd pick something easy to remember. Initials, sequential letters, repeated characters. Some operators became identifiable by their habits. One particular operator in North Africa consistently used the letters CLOY as his starting position. Every single day. It was his girlfriend's name. The Allied cryptanalysts called him Silly Boy. And every morning they'd try those letters first. More often than not, it worked. This man, who never knew his personal life had become a security liability, may have been responsible for hundreds of successfully decrypted messages that revealed enemy positions, supply situations, and battle plans. Human weakness became the key that opened impossible locks. Breaking a code once is impressive. Breaking it consistently, every single day before the information becomes obsolete, that's a different problem entirely. Even with cribs and known operator habits, testing settings manually took too long. By the time you'd worked out today's key, tomorrow's messages would be arriving in a different code. Naval Enigma was particularly difficult because it used an extra rotor and changed settings more frequently than other variants. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost because ships were being sunk faster than they could be built, and no one could warn the convoys where the submarines were gathering. The solution required hardware. Drawing on pre-war Polish designs and new insights about Enigma's weaknesses, engineers at Bletchley Park built a machine called the bomb. Not a weapon but an automated logical testing device. It was roughly the size of a large wardrobe, filled with rotating drums that simulated Enigma rotors. You'd feed it a crib, your guessed plaintext aligned with the encrypted message, and the machine would systematically test thousands of possible rotor positions, looking for settings that produced a logical result. When the bomb found a contradiction, a setting that would require a letter to encrypt to two different letters simultaneously, it would eliminate that possibility and move on. When it found a setting that worked consistently across the entire crib, it would stop. Operators would then test that setting manually against the full message to verify the break. The first bomb went operational in early 1940. By 1942, multiple improved versions were running simultaneously, processing different Enigma variants. But they still needed human insight to work. The machines didn't find codes, they tested hypotheses faster than any human could. The breakthrough still required someone to feed them the right question. And this is where our central figure becomes crucial. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, as the Battle of the Atlantic reached its crisis point, one cryptanalyst was developing new methods for attacking naval Enigma. This variant was considered the hardest to break because it used an additional rotor and because naval operators were more disciplined about security than other services. Previous successes against Army and Air Force codes didn't translate. The key innovation was recognizing that even naval messages contained predictable elements. Weather reports, position grids, coordinate systems, and critically, a quirk in how the naval Enigma encoded numbers. Digits were spelled out as words, 1, 2, 3, which meant number-heavy messages like position reports contained repeated patterns that could be exploited. By late 1941, this approach was yielding results. Not every message, not even every day, but enough. Enough to start tracking submarine positions. Enough to route convoys away from danger. By mid-1942, the impact was measurable. Ship losses in the Atlantic began to decline. Not dramatically, the struggle would continue into 1943, but noticeably. Convoys were surviving. Supply lines were holding. The people on those ships never knew why. The submarine commanders never understood why their ambushes kept failing. Even most of the staff at Bletchley Park didn't know the full extent of the operation. Information was shared on a strict need-to-know basis. But in the cold mathematics of war, the equation had shifted. The invisible weapon was working. Here's something that rarely appears in dramatic retellings of wartime code breaking: the psychological burden. Imagine knowing that an enemy convoy is heading toward an ambush. You've read their orders. You know exactly where they're going and when they'll arrive. You could save hundreds of lives by warning them, except doing so would reveal that you've broken their code. They'd change their encryption system, and you'd lose your access to their communications entirely. You'd save those hundreds today and sacrifice thousands tomorrow. Now imagine making that calculation not once but constantly. Every piece of intelligence you decrypt comes with the same question: is this important enough to act on? Or will acting on it compromise the source? This is why much of what was learned at Bletchley Park wasn't used directly. The intelligence had to be disguised. If a decrypted message revealed a submarine position, Naval Command wouldn't just send ships directly there. They'd send reconnaissance aircraft first, making it look like the submarine had been spotted accidentally. Only after this sighting would ships be redirected to attack. If decoded messages revealed an enemy supply convoy's route, Allied commanders would position submarines along that route and wait, making the interception look like patrol activity rather than foreknowledge. Sometimes, valuable intelligence couldn't be used at all because there was no plausible way to disguise how it had been obtained. The cryptanalysts themselves weren't making these decisions, they were passed up to senior military and intelligence officials. But they knew what was happening. They'd break a message revealing something urgent, something actionable, and then watch to see if anything happened. Often nothing did. The ethical complexity of possessing knowledge you couldn't fully use weighed heavily on people who were, after all, trying to save lives. And there was another burden: recognition. The people doing this work, mathematicians, linguists, engineers, were accomplishing something extraordinary. They were winning battles without ever setting foot on a battlefield. They were saving lives by the thousands. And none of them could ever talk about it. Not during the war. Not after. Not to their families, their friends, their colleagues. Success in this invisible war meant remaining invisible. For the individual at the center of our story, this burden was compounded by another factor: being different in ways that society at the time did not accept. Living with secrets upon secrets. achieving things that would never be publicly acknowledged, making contributions that would be classified for decades. The machinery of recognition, medals, promotions, public gratitude, didn't apply here. There were no parades for people whose greatest achievement was something that officially never happened. By the summer of 1942, the intelligence flowing from Bletchley Park was affecting operations across multiple theaters. North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. Soviet operations on the Eastern Front benefited from warnings about enemy intentions, though the Soviets were never told the source of the intelligence. The impact was subtle because it had to be. Wars aren't won by single miraculous interventions, they're won by cumulative advantages. Knowing where enemy submarines were gathering meant convoys could be rerouted, saving fuel and ships. Knowing enemy supply situations meant Allied planners could strike when the opposition was weakest. Knowing which enemy reports were accurate and which were exaggerated meant resources could be allocated more efficiently. In North Africa, decoded messages revealed supply problems and unit strengths, helping commanders understand when to press advantages. In the Mediterranean, intelligence about convoy routes allowed interdiction of supplies heading to opposing forces. In the Atlantic, the long battle against submarines slowly turned as convoy routing became more effective. None of this was obvious to people outside the intelligence loop. Commanders receiving intelligence reports didn't always know where the information came from. Soldiers benefiting from superior tactical awareness had no idea their advantages came from cryptanalysis rather than conventional reconnaissance. But the effect was real. Post-war analysis would estimate that effective signals intelligence shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years. 2 years of battles not fought. Cities not destroyed. Lives not lost. The exact numbers are impossible to calculate, but the strategic impact was enormous. And at the heart of it was something profoundly unmilitary: patience, pattern recognition, and systematic thought. The ability to work with incomplete information. The willingness to test hypotheses that seemed absurd. The persistence to keep trying approaches that failed 99 times before succeeding on the 100th attempt. This wasn't heroism in the traditional sense. There was no moment of dramatic bravery, no charge across no man's land, no last stand against overwhelming odds. It was the heroism of showing up every day to do difficult, frustrating work whose results you'd never see and whose success you could never celebrate. It was the heroism of being excellent at something no one could know about. The story doesn't end with victory in 1945. In many ways, that's where the difficult part began. When the war ended, the British government made a decision that would affect thousands of people. Everything about Bletchley Park would remain classified. The Enigma machines would be destroyed or given to foreign governments who didn't know they'd been compromised. The bomb machines would be dismantled. The documents would be locked away. And the people who had worked there would be reminded of their secrecy oaths and sent back to civilian life with instructions never to speak about what they'd done. For many, this meant returning to ordinary jobs after having done extraordinary things. Mathematicians went back to teaching. Linguists returned to translation work. Engineers moved into civilian industries. And none of them could explain the gap in their professional history. They'd spent years of their lives on work that officially didn't exist, developing skills they couldn't acknowledge, contributing to a success they couldn't claim. Some struggled with the transition. The work at Bletchley Park had been intense, purposeful, urgent. Every day brought new puzzles that mattered desperately. Returning to peacetime routine felt hollow by comparison. And the isolation of secrecy was profound. You couldn't commiserate with former colleagues. You couldn't process your experiences. You just had to carry them silently. The central figure of our story faced additional challenges. Despite contributing innovations that were crucial to Allied success, recognition was impossible. Not just public recognition, even professional acknowledgement within the intelligence community was limited by ongoing secrecy concerns and by social attitudes of the era that were hostile toward certain kinds of difference. In the years following the war, life became increasingly difficult. Unable to explain past achievements, facing discrimination, isolated by secrets that couldn't be shared, the burden became unsustainable. In 1954, just 9 years after the war ended, this person died under tragic circumstances at age 41. The work remained classified. The contributions remained unknown. The genius remained unacknowledged. It wasn't until the 1970s, more than 30 years after the fact, that the British government began declassifying information about wartime cryptanalysis. Slowly, the story of Bletchley Park emerged into public knowledge. The people who had worked there could finally talk about what they'd done. Books were written. Documentaries were made. The mansion itself became a museum. And gradually, The world learned about the mathematician whose insights had been crucial to breaking naval Enigma, whose innovations in logical analysis had helped develop modern computing concepts, whose work had saved countless lives through the application of pure thought to practical problems. The recognition came too late for it to matter personally, but it matters historically. It matters that we understand how wars are fought not just with weapons but with information. It matters that we recognize brilliance even when it works in silence. It matters that we acknowledge the people whose contributions couldn't be celebrated in their own time. Let's step back and consider what this story really means. The obvious lesson is tactical. In modern warfare, information is as important as firepower. Knowing your enemy's plans while keeping yours secret creates asymmetric advantages that can be decisive. This was true in 1942, and it remains true today, only amplified by technologies that would seem like magic to those wartime cryptanalysts. But there's something deeper here about how we think about conflict and contribution. Traditional military history focuses on battles, dramatic moments where armies clash and outcomes are decided visibly. We remember generals who commanded forces, soldiers who fought bravely, specific engagements where territory changed hands. These things are important. They involve real sacrifice and real courage. But they're not the whole story. Behind every military decision is an intelligence picture. What commanders think they know about enemy strength, position, intention, capability. That picture can be accurate or delusional. It can be based on real information or enemy deception. And the quality of that picture determines whether attacks succeed or fail, whether defenses hold or collapse, whether resources are used efficiently or wasted. The invisible weapons, signals intelligence, cryptanalysis, deception operations, psychological warfare, shape the battlefield before the first shot is fired. They create conditions for victory or defeat. And they do it quietly, without glory, often without acknowledgement. The people who wield these weapons need different skills than traditional warriors. They need patience rather than aggression, pattern recognition rather than physical courage, the ability to think probabilistically, to work with uncertainty, to accept that most attempts will fail and persist anyway. These aren't personality traits that society traditionally celebrates as heroic. They don't fit our narrative expectations about how wars are won, but they matter enormously. And here's the paradox. The more effective these invisible weapons become, the less visible their effects are. When cryptanalysis is working perfectly, battles aren't fought because ambushes are avoided. Ships aren't sunk because convoys are rerouted. Attacks fail because defenders knew they were coming. The victories look like non-events, things that didn't happen rather than things that did. How do you celebrate preventing a disaster? How do you measure lives saved by decisions not made? How do you recognize people whose greatest achievement was averting outcomes that never occurred? We struggle with this kind of accounting. We want heroes we can point to, dramatic moments we can commemorate, clear before and after comparisons. The work of intelligence doesn't provide those satisfactions. It provides quieter, more ambiguous successes, percentage points of advantage that accumulate into strategic superiority over time. The story of Bletchley Park is fundamentally about people whose contribution to victory was making other people's contributions more effective. The soldiers who survived battles because their commanders had better intelligence didn't know they'd been saved. The convoys that reached port because they'd been routed away from submarine packs credited good fortune. The commanders who made successful decisions because they knew enemy positions attributed their success to tactical brilliance. The invisibility wasn't incidental, it was essential. The moment the enemy realized their communications were compromised, the advantage would disappear. So success required permanent secrecy, permanent anonymity, permanent absence of recognition. And that burden fell most heavily on the people doing the work. They couldn't explain their value. They couldn't defend their contributions. They couldn't point to their achievements when facing discrimination or dismissal. Their excellence had to remain hidden even from themselves in a sense. They could know intellectually what they'd accomplished, but they could never receive the social validation that makes accomplishment meaningful in human terms. For someone who was already marginalized by society for other reasons, this double invisibility, hidden work, hidden identity, created a psychological situation that was perhaps impossible to sustain indefinitely. Every generation thinks it has discovered something new about warfare. New technologies, new strategies, new ways of gaining advantage. And then, if we look carefully at history, we find that the fundamental patterns remain consistent. Information matters more than numbers. Strategy matters more than strength. Understanding your enemy matters more than destroying them. And the people who provide those advantages, the analysts, the codebreakers, the intelligence specialists, remain perpetually undervalued compared to those who execute operations based on the intelligence they provide. We see this pattern repeat in every conflict. In World War II, cryptanalysis. In the Cold War, signals intelligence and spy networks. In recent decades, cyber operations and digital surveillance. The technologies change, but the principle doesn't. Knowing what your adversary plans to do before they do it gives you options that no amount of conventional military force can provide. And yet we continue to struggle with recognizing and valuing this kind of work. It doesn't fit our cultural narratives about heroism and sacrifice. It doesn't provide the emotional satisfaction of visible victory. It requires us to trust that invisible people are doing important things we can't see or understand. The mathematician at the center of our story, whose name has been carefully omitted throughout this narrative to focus on the work rather than the individual, represents something larger than one person's genius. This person represents the countless others whose contributions to significant events remain unknown because the nature of their work requires secrecy. The intelligence analyst whose insights prevent terrorist attacks. The cybersecurity specialist whose work stops breaches that never make headlines. The researchers whose discoveries enable technologies they'll never be credited for creating. In a sense, this invisibility is the price of effectiveness. If your work is genuinely important to national security, it remains classified. If your insights are truly valuable, they're protected from disclosure. If your contributions are significant, they're attributed to generic, intelligent sources, rather than named individuals. This creates a strange paradox. The more important your work, the less recognition you receive. The more lives you save, the less visible your achievement. The more effectively you serve, the more thoroughly you disappear from the historical record. Is this fair? Of course not. But fairness isn't the operative principle in matters of security and survival. Effectiveness is. And so we return to that room in 1942, to that moment of silent breakthrough when pattern became meaning and chaos resolved into order. That moment wasn't dramatic. No explosions. No visible change. Just the quiet satisfaction of understanding something that had previously been incomprehensible. From that moment flowed consequences that rippled across continents and through years. Ships that survived their voyages. Soldiers who came home. Cities that weren't destroyed. All because someone saw what others couldn't see and found a way to turn that vision into actionable knowledge. The weapon wasn't a machine. It was a mod. And the victory wasn't won in a single battle. It was won in thousands of small advantages that accumulated into strategic superiority. That's what invisible weapons look like. Not spectacular. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing that makes for exciting stories about heroism and sacrifice. Just necessary, effective, and profoundly human in their requirement for insight, persistence, and the willingness to work without recognition toward goals that may never be publicly acknowledged. The codes were broken. The messages were read. The war was shortened. Lives were saved. And for decades no one knew. That silence was part of the weapon. And breaking that silence, finally acknowledging what was accomplished and by whom, is how we honor not just individual achievement but the principle that thought can be as powerful as force, that knowledge can be as decisive as courage, and that the most effective victories are sometimes the ones no one sees. The rotors turned. The settings were found. The impossible became merely difficult and then routine. And somewhere in the Atlantic, a convoy reached port safely, its crew never knowing that the submarine pack that should have intercepted them had been rerouted to a location where nothing waited but empty ocean. That's what winning looks like when the weapon is invisible. Quiet. Unremarkable. And absolutely essential.